We do not suggest that the people of the first civilizations, the literate town dwellers of Ur and Mohenjo-Daro and Anyang, were necessary civil or urbane, but they were literate and lived in towns and were the first people to do so in the long process of man's cultural and social evolution from the darkest savagery of the early Paleolithic. Remembering the book of Genesis where Cain was ousted out of the Garden of Eden, went into the land of Nod, and he found himself a wife, had children, and he created the first village or city, supposedly. So it went on from there. So yeah, it would have started through his descendants, who probably merged into Mesopotamia and built a nation there over the centuries. And he gives the terms of civilization and culture. And he talks about Lubbock again. Lubbock, though he was an archaeologist among many other things, was writing at a time before many of the great archaeological discoveries of man's earliest civilizations had been made. He wrote, too, at a time when, though Charles Darwin had disturbed complacent people by the publication of his The Origin of Species in 1859, and Charles Lyell and John Evans had further disturbed people by the acceptance in that very same Annus Mirabilis of the great antiquity of man, there was a fairly clear and a fairly comfortable idea as to what civilization was. It was Western Europe, and the Victorian age was the proud pinnacle of their edifice, Western civilization. We, all of us, in a wide variety of ways, still use this tag phrase, Western civilization. We are proud of it, ashamed of it. It is the great glory of democracy and Christianity. It is bourgeois capitalism. We are ready to die for it. It is effete, and already dying on its feet. It all depends on how you look at it. And in many a place we still encounter the traditional history book picture of the evolution and the components of Western civilization, the three components from Athens and Rome and Jerusalem. Athens gave Western civilization its intellectual and artistic heritage, Rome the practical achievement of government and law, and Jerusalem its faith and morals. Viewed thus, it is all as simple as that, and the notion is often repeated in this simplistic form. But even in the 19th century, this over-simple story of the three civilizations which lay behind the medieval and modest Western Greek, Roman and Hebrew was obviously not a complete and full story. The humanist and the Christian, even without detailed archaeological sources and relying on the dubious historicity of the Bible and the more accurate observations and descriptions of men like Herodotus, who was actually believed to be telling the truth, everything he said was fact, when he was actually a liar, deemed a liar eventually. Knew of Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and of Medes and Persians, he's an exaggerator. The humanist and the Christian, even without detailed archaeological sources and relying on the dubious historicity of the Bible and the more accurate observations and descriptions of men like Herodotus, knew of Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and of Medes and Persians. Most scholars had forgotten, or had chosen to forget, that in the period between 1492, it's when Columbus discovered America supposedly, and 1530, the period from Columbus to Amerigo Vespucci, civilizations had been discovered and in part destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors in Central America. It is, incidentally, one of the curiosities of the development of the study of man's antiquity in these British Isles in England, that they have hitherto paid very little attention to the pre-Columbian civilizations of America. The average cultivated reader probably knows even less about the Maya, the Aztecs and the Incas of America than he does about the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Harappans, and the people of the Shang civilization of China. But if the Victorians thought little about what lay behind Greece and Rome and the Medes and the Persians, and paid little attention to Central America, they had some vague ideas of the antiquity of civilized life in India and China. Had not China invented paper and gunpowder, and were then not sahibs and Kais who had seen something damn interesting old remains in the jungles of India, and was there not among a few fairly a feeling that rope tricks and sword swallowing fakirs apart, there was some very ancient wisdom in the East, and so forth. When the author speaks then of the origins of civilization, he meant the origins of the first literate town dwellers, discussing what Gordon Child called the urban revolution. We'll see what the author preferred to call the process of Cenozoism. It was not a revolution but an evolution, and one that took place in several parts of the world. Our problem is how and why and where and when barbarian societies made this leap forward into literate town-dwelling communities. And here is the nub of the question: did this forward leap take place once only, or did it take place many times? We have already begged another question by referring, or the author has already begged another question by referring over and over again to barbarism. The Greeks knew what they meant by barbarians. They called them barbaroi, which is the same thing as barbarophonoi. That is to say, the people who spoke a foreign or barbarian language, the people who went ba, ba, ba. That's what Roy Casagandra says on his video on YouTube, The Rise of Islam, but he used the Romans. The Romans came across these barbarians and they didn't like the way they spoke, and they described it as ba, ba, ba. And someone came and said, oh no, that's a load of rubbish. Well, here it is, by a much older writer, so many years before Roy Casagrande. The Rise of Islam stated the same or similar. So you better shout us dinner, take us dancing, romance us, because you said that we're talking a load of rubbish. You know who you are. The Greeks met these people on the frontiers of the civilized world and had names for them such as Samaritans or Sarmatians. So it's supposed to be Samaritans, I'm not really sure. Sarmatians and Scythians and Celts and Ligurians. Herodotus gave an account of a people living in a lake village in Greece, and here he was writing an ethnographical account of what we nowadays would call a Neolithic or Bronze Age community. The barbarians whom the Greeks met had many things in common. They were illiterate, they didn't live in towns, some of them were nomadic and drank mare's milk, female horse milk, and some of them surprisingly wore trousers. But the worst crime was that they didn't speak Greek, and that showed clearly how barbarians they were. Yet the barbarians, although they had no talents for writing or literature, were accomplished in many arts and crafts. They had domesticated animals, indeed many of them were horse riders, and they cultivated grain. Some of them, like the Celts and Scythians, had developed a remarkable style of art. They were indeed near civilized, or so thought the Greeks. Chapter 2, the discovery of the first civilization. In the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis are these words: And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar or Sumer, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. These words were set down in Hebrew not earlier than 800 B.C. Well, we believe it was the original ancient, very old Tab Asher or Aramaic, not the Hebrew, because as we showed in our other video, the Hebrews were a movement of people. It wasn't a language. Movement of people. The descendants of Noah, one of them being the son of Apashkad, who was deemed the father of the Hebrew, who then eventually had a son called Heber, or Heber, Heber, who then merged with the people of Chaldea, Ur of Chaldea, Abraham and his family. Well, they're all related anyway. And then they went to the promised land, that land promised by God to be given to Abraham. So they were called or those who crossed over, made a passage, made a journey. Okay, they made a journey to another land, from Ur of Chaldea to the land of Canaan, which may have been descendants of the Egyptians, not the Hebrews. Okay, so they went there and they adopted and adapted their language, and they called their god El, which was a pagan idol god. They took on the Canaanite language. That's where they got the word El from, and they scripted or scribed the scriptures wrong. Okay, their name wrong into the scriptures, because the original name was from the original ancient, very old Aramaic of Tab Asher, El, E-I-L. That was the name of God, not El. El is the article the, as in the, as in Elohim, the God or the gods, El Shaddai, the whatever that means, and so forth. Okay, oh, the Lord probably. Okay, so the words found in the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis not earlier than 800 BC, because the scribes and monks in Urhai, Edessa, now modern Turkey, actually copied the Lishana Artika Sumeria of that Old Testament or Tab Asher, Genesis, etc. into their. They used that Lishana Artika language that they knew to write those particular Old Testament scriptures. We copied them, right? It gives a few sentences, an account of the origins of the oldest, first civilization made by man, the civilization of the land of Shinar or Sumer, the land of Sumer. They did make a name for themselves, and that name was the Sumerians. So they didn't say we are Arameans or Babylonians or Jews. They called themselves Sumerians, because that's where they were, in the land of Sumer, building the ziggurat or the tower. Until God knocked down, stopped them from making that tower, and gave them multiple languages, supposedly 72 of them, and they couldn't understand each other, and then they were scattered all across the earth, meaning that Middle Eastern area, not to Australia or New Zealand or the Fiji Islands, right? It was in that general area. Yeah, in the Levant. In this particular chapter, the next chapter The author's concern was with the light which archaeology throws on the origin of Sumerian civilization. He had already referred to the doubtful historicity of the Bible, and by that he meant the inability to accept all that is in the beginning of the Old Testament as a true and certain guide to the origin of the world, the genesis of man, and the development of his culture from the savagery, if that is the right word, of the Gardens of Eden, through the peasant agriculture of Cain and stock raising Abel to the city life of Babel, and to the ancient civilizations of the Near East which the Old Testament people witnessed in Egypt, Babylon and elsewhere. But hidden in their interesting congeries of myths and legends, many directly derived from Mesopotamia before Abraham set off from Ur of the Chaldees, are some historical facts, as we shall see, and indeed as it is easy to see nowadays with the hindsight of 100 and more years of archaeological research in Southwest Asia. Noah and the flood must surely reflect some of the floods of inundated Lower Mesopotamia from time to time. Yeah, because apparently, according to the translator from Bet-Nahrain, Victor N. Alexander, the Arabic scripture translated to English, many floods happened in the Mesopotamian region. We also have a book called The Timetables of History by Bernard Grun, based upon Werner Stein's Culture File Plan, which states the same thing on page 3. Mesopotamian floods in that region, and that page is page 3, under the heading G, Daily Life, between minus 4,000 to 3,501, minus 3501. Disastrous floods in the Mesopotamian region. So it's hinting there that that's what happened in that particular region at that particular time. There may not have been an immediate global flood, as claimed. It may have come later, when perhaps a meteorite from space hit the Earth, caused tidal waves, volcanic eruptions, etc., melted the polar ice caps, and therefore flooding the whole world. Maybe that's the difference. The story of the conflict between Abel and Cain is a reflection of the conflict between the steppe and the sown, the desert and the irrigated river valley, a constant theme in ancient Mesopotamian history. Sumer is a territory which after 2000 BC was called Babylonia. The plain of the land of Shinar is the land between the rivers, the land between the twin rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The Greeks called this land Mesopotamia, which word means just that, the land between the rivers. It's actually Bet-Nahrain in the Syrian. Most of it today is part of the modern state of Iraq, or ancient Iraq, although the Euphrates rises in Syria and the Tigris in Turkey. From the Turkish border and the Armenian mountains in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south is roughly 600 miles, about the distance from Aberdeen to Dover. From the Syrian desert on the west to the mountain of Persia, the Zagros mountains on the east is some 200 to 250 miles. In this area, and more especially in the south, the Sumerian civilization came into existence in the second half of the 4th millennium BC.